Hey guys, welcome back. How are you? I hope you are good and doing well. In the last lecture, we discussed about the difference between validations provided by the active model and validation provided by the active record. Okay, and we take basic understanding of it. Okay, now in this lecture, we will learn that how we can validate a plain Ruby class. Okay, focus on that we will try to validate a plain Ruby class, not a Rails model. Okay, because validations are always supported by the Rails model, so we don't need to do any additional setting for that, and we can apply any kind of model which is related to the database level or non-database level. So we can apply all the validation in a Rails model. Okay, but in a plain Ruby class, we need to do some setting, and the setting is like including the active model in that Ruby class, and there is some limitation that what kind of validation we can apply in plain Ruby class and what kind of validations we cannot apply in it. Okay, so let's try to implement a plain Ruby class using active model in it, and then we will see what kind of validations will work and how it works. Okay, so let's go to the some tech code file. Okay, and here let's try to create a plain Ruby class. Let's say class employee. Okay, and then end this class. Okay, now in this class let's define some attr accessors. Okay, let's say employee can have a name and then email, then let's say contact number, and let's say status. Okay, now these are the attributes that we will try to validate. Okay, like employee must have a name, employee must have an email, employee must have a contact number, and employee must have a status. Okay, whether it is active, inactive, or anything. Now, how we can provide validation in the Rails? Okay, so we will provide validation in Rails like in this format. Okay, so for example, let's say validates name, email, contact number, and status, and add presence true, or remove status from here, and let's say presence true. Okay, so this is how we usually provide validation in Rails. Okay, but in plain Ruby class this will not work in this way. Okay, why? Because plain Ruby classes doesn't support validations by default. Okay, what we need to do here, that we need to do include and then active model. Okay, and if you do this, I mean include active model, then you can define any number of attributes in your class and you can add validation rules over there. Okay, so here you can see what we did here. We did include active model, and then we define some attribute accesses like name, email, contact number, and status, and you can consider these attribute accesses like we have some attribute in the employee table in the database. Okay, however it's a plain Ruby class, so if this employee class doesn't have any connection with the database yet. Okay, now you can see that validates name, email, contact number. Okay, and we added validation presence too, so this will work. Okay, and let's see how we can define an employee. For example, let's say emp equal to employee dot new. Okay, now let's try to create this class. Okay, so we will create this class into the Rails console. Okay, so open the Rails console. However, you can try this into the IRB console as well. Okay, so let's paste this, and you can see the class has been created. Now let's try to define an employee. Let's say emp equal to employee dot new. When you do this, you will see that an empty employee object has been created here, or sorry, initialized here. Okay, now what you will do, emp dot valid. Okay, because usually we add validation in the class and then we try to perform whether this is valid object or not, so we use valid method. Okay, and when you do this, you will see false in the return. That means this employee object is not valid here. Now if you see emp dot errors dot messages, sorry, there is typo in the errors. So emp dot errors dot message, so you can see name can't be blank, email can't be blank, and contact number can't be blank. That means we can apply presence to validation in this, and presence to validation is not for the database level. Okay, when you initialize an object Okay, and you just want to make sure that when you initialize it, its value must be present. Okay, so here you can see that this validation will be checked. Okay, so presence true can be supported in the plain Ruby class. Okay, and now one can argue that why presence true validation is not for the database layer. Okay, I'm saying this because in Rails, when you do presence true, okay, it will first check the values before saving these values into the database. Okay, and if it checked before performing any operation in the database, that means it is not for the database specific. It is just checking that value should not be blank when you initialize it. Okay, or when you trying that this is valid object or not. Okay, so that's why you can use presence true, and this is not restricted to the database level. Okay, now let's add some other validation on the employee class. Let's say we want to do employee email format. Okay, so let's try to validate the format of email. So here let's add another validation, that is, let's say validates email. Okay, and then format, sorry, okay, format, and here we need to provide some option, that is format with, and then URI mail to. Okay, and then email regex. Okay, so here what you need to do, email, sorry, it should be all in capital, email regexp. Okay, so what this validation will do in, usually, because usually we sorry, usually we use email in the device models, and device automatically provide validation for the email attribute. Okay, so if you are not using the device, you can use this validation format to validate the format of your email, like it must have some name at the rate example.com. Okay, so some name and some domain. Okay, so this is just to validating a proper email format. Now we will see that whether this email will work or not. Okay, so let's copy this class again, and let's try to instantiate it here. Okay, so when you do, you can see thus for it supports the format as well. Okay, now let's try to define emp equal to, sorry, let's say emp1 equal to employee.new. Okay, and then what we can do here, let's say name is, let's say Ravi Singh, email, let's say Ravi. Okay, and then contact number, and here you can provide 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 0. Okay, now let's try to see whether this emp1 is valid or not. Okay, so you will see it's still false. Why? Because now you can see emp1 dot errors messages, and you will see email is invalid. Okay, that means this format is not supported by the emails. Okay, and it's an invalid email format. Okay, now let's try to do something like that. For example, let's say Ravi at the rate example.com. Okay, and let's rename this employee as employee2. Okay, now let's check emp2 is valid or not. Okay, so it's valid. Okay, and if you check emp dot errors, sorry, emp2 dot errors dot messages, you will see a blank array. Okay, oh, sorry, a blank hash. Okay, with no keys and no messages for the respective attributes. Okay, so what we can say here, that we can provide presence validation, we can provide format validation, and we can also provide the length validation as well. Okay, and now let's try to check the inclusion validation. Okay, so here what we can do, let's say validates status. Okay, and then inclusion, and here in, and then you need to provide active, inactive, and let's say hold, sorry, hold. Okay, and then you can provide, let's say allow blank true. Okay, so now what this validation will do, so here you can see what I added: validates status inclusion in active inactive hold. Okay, and this validation is also not dependent on the database, so you can say that this is a non-database validation rule. Okay, why? Because we will save, we will check this validation before saving the object's value into the database. Okay, so this is not relies on the database level. Why? Because let's say whenever you initialize an employee object and you provide some values, let's say active, inactive, and hold, it will just check that whatever values you have provided, okay, it must match within this enumerable object which is containing three values: active, inactive, and hold. Okay, and here we also mentioned that allow blank true. That means whenever you leave the status attribute empty, you will not get an error. Why? Because we set allow blank true. Okay, that means either it should be null or it must be any of these three values: active, inactive, or hold. Okay, it cannot be anything else than that. Okay, and let's verify that. So what you can do, that just paste the copy this class and paste it into the console as well. Okay, or let's make it clear. Open the range console from scratch and then paste this class. Okay, now let's try to create an employee object. Okay, so emp equal to employee dot new. Okay, and now let's say, sorry, name as Ravi, sorry, email as, let's say, Ravi at the rate example.com. Okay, and then contact number as, let's say, okay, and then status. Okay, or let's provide the status as nil. Okay, so when you do this, you initialized an employee object. Okay, now if you do emp.valid, sorry, emp.valid, you will see it is true, there is no error. Why? Because in this line you can see that validates status inclusion in active, inactive, hold, and allow blank true. And what it is indicating, that you can leave the status value as null. Okay, that is fine, but if you set any of the values outside the active, inactive, and hold, you will get an error. Okay, and let's try that. So let's make it emp1, emp1, and now we will provide a status value which is outside this active, inactive, and hold. Okay, let's say status, let's say unknown. Okay, you do this. Okay, and let's try to check whether this emp1 is valid or not. It is valid or not, so it is false now. Okay, why? emp1.errors.message, that is status is not included in the list. Okay, that means your validation is working, but you must satisfy two conditions: that either it should be nil or it must be any one of the active, inactive, and hold. Okay, you cannot set any other status other than that. Okay, so here it is also clear that this is also not a database level validation. Why? Because here we are checking that status attribute must be any of this value or it must be nil. Okay, so this is not relies on the database, so we can use this validation in the plain ruby class. Okay, now let's see what happen if we remove this allow blank true. Okay, so first of all, whether this validation will work or not, you first need to understand that whether this validation is still valid or not. Here, what we did, that validation status inclusion in active, inactive, true. We did not mention whether it should be blank or it must be present. Okay, so we neither added allow blank nil, sorry, allow nil true or allow blank true, and we did not added presence true as well. Okay, now let's try to see whether this class is still valid or not. Okay, so if you do this and paste it here, you can still see inclusion in active, inactive, and hold. Okay, now let's try to instantiate an emp2. Okay, and set, do not set its status. Okay, and make this name as emp2. Okay, and now let's check whether this emp2 is valid or not. So we'll still see it is not valid. Why? Because you can see the error. And before checking the errors, let me tell you that why this is not active. Because we just mentioned in the validation that it must be included in active, inactive, hold. But if we do not provide it, it would be nil. Okay, and nil is not mentioned in the list. Okay, so here if you see status value nil. Okay, or you can see errors dot messages, you can see nil is not included in the list. Okay, so here you need to make sure that if you use your inclusion validation like this, what you need to do, if you do not support presence true or allow blank true, okay, what you need to do, you need to explicitly mention here that it can be nil as well. Okay, so now this validation will work. Okay, and what happened if you do this, like let's say presence true. So what happened now? Okay, now let's do this again. Okay, so what we added, inclusion in active, inactive, hold, and presence true. Okay, so now status must be present in, it must be any of the active, inactive, and hold. Okay, now let's instantiate this same employee. Let's say employee new without any status. So let's say emp3 equal to this, and now let's check emp3 dot valid whether this is valid or not. So you will see it is not valid. Okay, and now let's check dot errors. You will see, sorry, errors dot messages. You will see status is not included in the list, not in, and this is why, because we are checking, it is returning for the emp2 and emp1 as well. Okay, and here you can see it can't be blank. Okay, that means if you do something like that, you must make sure that you provide at least one value. Okay, now let's say if you do the same thing, let's say uh, sorry, status, let's say active, and if you do, you will set true. Okay, now no error messages for this employee 3 object. Okay, and it will return a valid object, so all the validations are being passed here. Okay, and all the validations that we added so far, which is presence true, format validation, inclusion validation, and if you wish you could try with the length validation as well, that will be all, that will also be supported here. Okay, so none of the validation are relies on the database. Why? Because all these validations are being validated before saving the values into the database, so there is no database specific operation after saving the values. Okay, now what will happen if you do this validates email, contact number, uniqueness true. Now what will happen? This will not be supported by the plain Ruby class or the active model. Why? Because uniqueness validation relies on the database. Okay. Why? Because it will basically check after saving the record into the database, and it will match across all the existing values, and if any value found already existing in the database, then it will return false or true. Okay, based upon that scenario. So uniqueness validation cannot be supported here. For example, what we can do here, if you execute this class, you will see an error. For example, let's say is console. Okay, and if you do this, you will see an error, that argument error, unknown validator. Okay, uniqueness validator is not be supported by the active model. And similarly, you cannot also support the plain Ruby classes also do not support the validations like has many, belongs to, okay, database specific levels. Okay, so these are the validations that we can support into the plain Ruby classes, and this is how we can validate a plain Ruby classes. Okay, so make sure that whenever you try to validate a plain Ruby class, first you need to make sure that you need to include this line, which is include active model, because all the validations are supported in this, and active record is just a superset of the validations provided by the active model. Okay, and in plain ruby classes you can only support the validation that does not really rely on the database level. Okay, only non database or non persistent validations can be tried or can be validated through the plain ruby classes. Okay, so here this uh, validates email, contact numbers, uniqueness true will not work. However, you can check the numericality. Okay, like whether the value is numerical or not. You can check the length validations. You can also add custom validations as well. But if they are not persistent to validations or they are not database level validation, then only plain ruby classes can support that using active model inclusion. Otherwise it will not support that. Okay, so I hope you get a clear idea that how we can validate a plain ruby class. And this lecture is important from two point of views. You can use the learning of this lecture into your interview preparations as well, or some client questions as well. And you can also uh, use this learning into implementing the validator classes or some modules that where you can define the validation and use across the multiple models. Or you can use you can use these active model validations on plain ruby classes for creating common forms between multiple models. Okay, so these are the basic uses of that, and we will see how we can do this in the upcoming lectures as well. Okay, so I hope you got the idea of it, and try this lecture. And if you have any question, let me know through the comment section, and we will meet into the next lecture. Till then, tata, goodbye, take care, stay safe.